and welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics. My name is Abby Clement, and I am a member of the Dole Institute Student Advisory Board, the official student group of the Institute. The Student Advisory Board is a bipartisan group whose members can access many great opportunities through their involvement with the Institute, including volunteering at programs and networking with our special guests. If you're a student and would like to join, please contact us by emailing dolesab@ku.edu or speaking with the student worker after the program. A video of today's program will be available on our YouTube channel soon. You can also access videos of past programs by visiting our YouTube channel at any time. A loop hearing system is available to use if you have a T-coil hearing aid. We also have a limited number of listening devices. If you have questions about the loop system, or if at any time during the program you have difficulty hearing, please alert one of our staff members. And after the program, we will have some time for the audience to ask questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand and a student worker with a microphone will come to you. Please stand if you are able and ask just one brief question. If you are part of our virtual audience, you may submit your questions to dolequestions@ku.edu. The Dole Institute's mission is to foster civil and respectful discussion around important and often difficult topics. Please raise your questions with this in mind. And before we begin, I'd like to remind you to please turn off your cell phones. Now, please join me in welcoming the director of the Dole Institute, Audrey Coleman.
Thank you so much, Abby. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics this evening. In celebration of Black History Month, we are proud to welcome you here tonight for the 7th installment of our Conversation on Race series. Before we get started this evening, I want to recognize two distinguished guests in our audience who've made a long journey to be with us. Dole Fellow, Dr. Chandram Gashi, and Dr. Enver Hassani, former president of the Constitutional Court of the Republic of Kosovo. I invite you to join us on Wednesday, March 1st at 4 p.m. for the third and final session of Chandram's outstanding discussion group series, Building Democracy in the 21st Century, in which Dr. Hassani will be his special guest. We look forward to that conversation, gentlemen. Now I have the pleasure of introducing this evening's guests. Dr. Maryemma Graham is the University of Kansas Distinguished Professor of English in the Department of English and founding director of the History of Black Writing, a dedicated archive and research center. Her 12th book, The House Where My Soul Lives, The Life of Margaret Walker, was published by Oxford University Press in December. Dr. Shawn Leigh Alexander is professor and chair of African and African American Studies and the director of the Langston Hughes Center at the University of Kansas. His area of research concentration is African American social and intellectual history of the 19th and 20th centuries. This evening's program will be moderated by Senior Associate Director of the Dole Institute, Dr. Barbara Ballard. Please give Dr. Maryemma Graham and Dr. Shawn Alexander a warm Jayhawk welcome.
Thank you and good evening. I am really thrilled that we can have this conversation this evening. When we named this, and I have to tell you how we came about a conversation on race, it was actually our student advisory board, and we have a student advisory board here at the Dole Institute of Politics, and we can have it at one point up to 100 students of all disciplines. And they just come, they participate, they welcome you when you came in, they give our greetings, they even get to choose their own topics and their own speakers and everything else. Well, it was right after George Floyd. And the students went to Bill Lacey, who was the rector at the time, and really said, we need to be on the cutting edge. We, meaning the Dole Institute of Politics. We need to make a statement about what is going on. So that is how we end up with this program, and we just called it a conversation on race. Knowing that often people shy away from race, they don't want to really talk about race, they feel intimidated by race, and yet they take pride in their race. So we decided we would call it what it really is, and not camouflage it, and go in another direction. And this is our 7th series. As you know, we're also live streaming so people can see us online as well. So I would simply say we are honoring the closing of Black History Month. And we know that Black History Month, we're proud to recognize the achievements, the accomplishments, the immeasurable perseverance that African Americans have had. And at the same time, it's hopeful that we will become a more caring nation, that we will look upon one another as just race and different, and that we will also become a more equitable nation. I think we have seen signs of that happening, if you think about it, in terms of how people in Kansas have been voting lately, what they're favoring. And we hope that Black History Month, as we had a conversation and dinner, is not just 1 month, but all the time. But I am so pleased that you've taken the time to be with us, and I hope and I know you will enjoy these 2 panelists this evening. The first question I will ask them is, why is Black history important? And I will start with Maryemma.
Okay, you're gonna put me on the spot here. Why is Black History Month, Black history important? The old saying, if you don't know your history, you're doomed to repeat it. So clearly that's what's happening right now, right? We are repeating a lot of our history. And it shows us who doesn't know the history and its importance. And so that suggests to me that we need to double down and do this even more intensely than we have before, because the history somehow got absorbed into something that put it in the shadows. So this month, if there is a reason for this month and for Black history in general to really resurface in an important way, is that it can help us to put the past in perspective, the future in perspective. So I think its importance really comes from the complexity of our history and the willingness of people like me, like you and others, the willingness to really dig deep and speak the truth, to tell all of the history, the good, the bad, the ugly. And I think that given the experience that Black people and many people who have come to this country have had, to give that story, to make it, put it up front and central, gives us the opportunity to really, again, reach for the truth, to tell the truth, no matter how complicated and difficult it is. You can't shy away from what makes you feel bad. And we are now at a moment when that is the reason that for giving people license to say something other than the truth, to cover it up. So I think we have reached a point where it's more important than it probably ever has been for us to have it, and for everybody to involve themselves in it in a particular kind of way. I can't tell you how you need to do it, but embrace it in a particular kind of way.
Okay, Shawn?
So, I mean, I echo everything that Dr. Graham has just said, and I would add to that world history, the modern world that we exist in, would not exist without Black history, without the Black experience. The Black experience has transformed every aspect of our lives. And by not recognizing that and understanding that, we fail to actually learn history. The modern Western Hemisphere would not exist in the way that we understand it, see it, without the Black experience. most of Europe would not also exist the way that we know it without understanding the Black experience. So Carter G. Woodson's idea was, while it was U.S. focused, was also talking about the diaspora and world history, and understanding the centrality of Black history, the Black experience, the African diaspora in the world that we have made. That can go to our modern banking system, our modern insurance companies, the events that we know, right? We can talk about slavery, we can talk about art and the creation of jazz, we can talk about numerous things, but we would not exist the way that we do without understanding Black history, and we fail as a population in the United States and the world by not recognizing that. And I think that the thing that we continue to struggle with is the inability to recognize that centrality of the Black experience, and by doing that, we give ourselves a false understanding of who we are.
Very good answers. You know, I think when we think about it, it is pride. And regardless of what your heritage is, there's a lot of pride in who you are, where you came from, how you survived, how you made it, the sacrifices that your ancestors made, especially your grandparents, your mom, your dad, all of those people. That is what we are proud of. But also we've had impact, and we have contributed significantly to this country and just never got the credit. So I think that's part of why the Black History Month. But we all know it should go on all the time, not just for African Americans, but all the races of color and all of the contributions that people have made. But I'm going to focus a little bit more on these two individuals, and that's why we asked them this evening. The first question: do you know that it's very unique for a white person and a male to be chair of African and African American Studies? We are looking at a unique person, and he would say, oh, no, but it is. So I'm going to ask him, how did you become interested in African American Studies? And what was your path to becoming a professor of Black Studies here at the University of Kansas?
It's difficult for me because I don't like to talk about myself, so let's see how we can do this. But I became interested in African history originally. I was I was a weird kid who liked to watch the news all the time. I used to use David Brinkley as the excuse not to go to early service with my family. And my mom would agree, but I'd have to tell her what was on David Brinkley, and then I had to go to the late church service. So in the 1980s, when I was in high school, South Africa was always in the news because of the apartheid system and the brutality that was there. And I was fascinated by it. And then one day, the cameras and the video footage just disappeared. And so I began to question why. And would go to my local library, try to get things. I lived in a small town just outside a large metropolitan area, and tried to get books. They didn't have a lot. And tried to research it. And so that drove me to go, when I decided I was going to go to college, I decided from the get-go that I was going to study African history, which again puts me in a weird category, right? I knew exactly what I wanted to do when I went to college. I went to a small Catholic school in Dubuque, Iowa, named Loras College. And I chose that school not because of the history department, but because they recruited me to run cross-country and track. And I assumed I would go there for maybe 2 years, get bored with running, and transfer out of the school to go to another university to continue to study African history. To my surprise and great fortune, the year I got to Loras, they had just hired a man named Fred Morton to teach African history. He had spent the last 17 years in Botswana, and they hired him to teach African and African American history. And Fred mentored me, taught me, he was relearning African American history. So I took independent studies with him. I sat in his office, and he really molded me and introduced me to the field. I never thought about being white in the field because he was white. So it never dawned on me, which was odd because we're kind of back in that world now. But this is the height of Afrocentricity. This is the rise of the Nation of Islam. It's the time that I probably should have been more aware, but I think the place that I was at didn't do it. And being a white kid writing on the Nation of Islam for your senior thesis in 1992 probably was not the best decision, especially with the racial climate that Dubuque, Iowa had at the time. So I usually just did my interviews on the phone with the Nation. But so that drove me and led me. And then Fred, when I said I want to go to grad school, Fred said, okay, these are the African programs I want you to go to. And I said, I don't want to do African studies anymore. I want to do African American. And he was very mad and frustrated, but sent me to a diasporic program at the University of Iowa. There was a man there named James Giblin, and he thought Jim would pull me back. But I went to study originally with Darwin Turner, famous African Americanist there, African American literature scholar. Unfortunately, Darwin passed away when I got there, and in my first semester. But again, it pulled me in that direction and drove me. By the time I was done with the master's, I knew I wanted to do this, to do Black Studies. But at that time, in the mid-1990s, early 1990s, there was only one PhD program in the country, and that was Temple, an Afrocentric, African-centered program that I didn't really want to go to, and I didn't know if I would be welcomed, being white in the field. So I took a diversion. I went to Japan, where my wife, girlfriend at the time, was living and teaching. I taught at a university there, African American history, American history, and taught English in the evening. And then all of a sudden, the University of Massachusetts department popped up, and I wanted to do that. It was the second program. I applied there, got there, and it was probably the best decision I ever made in my life. It was a group of people who had been together for 45 years at the time. And they passionately taught this field known as African American Studies. How did I get here? To the University of Kansas. It also drove me a very similar way. I'm not a historian. I'm a person that has a Black Studies degree. My undergraduate degree is in history, but my other degrees are all in Black Studies. I do use historical methods. I approach my work with history, but I use sociology and literature and numerous things, a true studies-trained scholar. But what drove me to the University of Kansas was it was a unique place that would allow me to be 100% in a Black Studies department, an African and African American Studies department, not have a joint appointment, not be part-time in Black Studies, part-time in English, or part-time in history, part-time in African American Studies, which most positions in the country still today are that way. They divide you and put you in different ways. And I wanted to 100% be in a Black Studies department. And so that was the decision that really drove me to a place like the University of Kansas, because it was a place that would give me that freedom to be 100% in this department.
Very nice.
Yeah.
All right, Maryemma. Now, Maryemma, you and I had a little conversation about your mom had taken you, I think, to hear Dr. Martin Luther King.
Yeah, I think that there are many stories associated with King that become, richer as we recall that history. He went to many places the months before he died. And one of those places was Augusta, Georgia, where I was born and raised. For those of you who do not know Augusta, Georgia, it is the home of James Brown. It's also the home of Frank Yerby, who is a first Black millionaire writer most people did not know was black. So I grew up in a town that was surrounded by excellence and culture, and the black experience was on display all the time. So King came to Shiloh Baptist Church to speak. My mother, who was a second grade teacher, who chose to teach in a rural community as opposed to the city. Augusta was a city at the time because it had golf and a big tournament, so that made it a city. So she went out and got a tape recorder, reel to reel. It was German made. And she said, this man is coming to speak, we need to keep that. We need to record that. She did not know how to operate the equipment, but she brought it to the church. And I was, I don't know, I wasn't out of elementary school. So I'm following my mother. It was a Sunday afternoon, and so the program was in the afternoon so that everybody could come and not be torn away from their respective churches or mass, in the morning. And she recorded King's speech at Shiloh Baptist Church on a reel-to-reel recorder, brought it home, and we kept it for a really long time. Of course, when he died, soon thereafter, my mother said, she didn't use the word archive. She said, this tape is important. And I kept that tape, but I didn't know very much about preservation, archival work, much of which I do, and I do now, as you know. And ultimately, that tape disintegrated. When I tried to have it transferred, and it broke right in the middle. There was nothing we could do about it. But the story stayed with me. Preserve information, don't let it go, make sure that you mark these moments. But the town I grew up in was really a culturally rich community, so it wasn't just the historical moment, it was every place I went, I was surrounded by experiences that showed what I would call the excellence in black culture. You would go to a tea in the Sunday afternoon and somebody would be reciting black poetry. For my people or Langston Hughes, and if you didn't know that stuff, you were considered less than. It wasn't necessarily in school, it was every place you went in your community. If you were expected to compete in a contest, your best bet was to pick something from black literature to recite, because people really enjoyed that and they would get you over the top. So I was reciting poems, and my best girlfriend is the one who always won those contests. I was not as good as her. She's an actor today, as you can imagine. So music. My mother was also a musician. She was a teacher, but was a musician. And so she loved the choirs and the opportunities to sing when someone came to town. She would even just help them get settled. So whether it was music or literature, and we grew up with the stories. So my mother kept telling me all along, again, guiding me, and I was a single mom. My father died when I was very young, even though his history and legacy were very important in our lives. I understood, growing up in that community, that black community, because I am a crossover kid. I was segregated community, segregated schools, but had opportunities to do other kinds of things, which I took full advantage of. But what I would say is that what I remember, excellence was always on display. People were always trying to say to you, you got to be better than so-and-so. And those people were all really very good. I don't think I ever mastered a performance of a poem like a couple of people I would hear. And they were reading way back. They were reciting Paul Laurence Dunbar. Those of you who don't know these names, he was known to be a dialect poet, but he, of course, also wrote standard English poems more than the dialect, but the public only wanted his dialect poetry. So people would recite him by heart. I could not be that good. I mean, I saw people really being good, and I thought, I'm never going to be like that. So the best thing I thought I could do was study the stuff and talk about how important it was and how everybody should know this. So in the tradition, my family tradition, I went to an HBCU for college.
And what's a HCBU?
Historically Black college and institution. Payne College in Augusta was both a high school and a college, which was often the case for many of those schools. By the time I got there, of course, it was just a college, but my father had gone there, and he had come from a town that didn't have a public school for black kids. He had a private education, basically a black church school from 7th to about 7th grade, and then he walked or found a way 92 miles to get to Payne College to go to high school. Painting by night, going to school by day. So I went to that same school. My mother had gone to that school. That's where she met my father. So it was appropriate for me to go to that Payne College, and I was going to school early, so I wasn't ready to leave home, so to speak. 15 going to college is fairly young. And so stay home, make sure you don't get in any trouble. Maybe you can go a little bit later. So Payne College was where I was again surrounded by, no matter what the state said, no matter what the policies were, when we took speech, we recited all of the black poetry and the black speeches and Frederick Douglass, and we knew all of that. We were given opportunities to perform. When we did plays, we did all the black plays by Langston Hughes and others. I was introduced to all of that in that school. I wanted to be a journalist. There were so many stories growing up. I felt like I needed to be the person to bring those stories to the world. I didn't know what to call it, but if I could just bring them together, now we know it's an anthology. I wanted to bring them together and share with everybody. So my English teacher said to me, you sound like you want to be a journalist. You want to tell stories, write stories. And she said, I want you to go to a summer program. She sent me to the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill for the summer to take a journalism course. Of course, I'm going to school at a time when a lot of students are going to school. And I get to Chapel Hill, Duke is having its first black basketball players, and all kinds of things are happening. And I'm around this community of black students. I thought I could come to this school and continue what I had been experiencing at my HBCU. Nothing could have been further from the truth. I get to my first English class. I transferred after that summer, and the teacher stood before me. We were reading one short story by Richard Wright, and that was the example of a black writer in this general literature class. And so I had been told never to hold back questions, and so maybe 100 students, those seminars, those classes, I raised my hand when we're reading Richard Wright. And so I said, are we going to read anybody else? Any other black writers, Negro, whatever I said, I don't remember. But I remember the experience, what I had in that moment. He looked at me and said, there were no black writers before Richard Wright. I was absolutely floored. Some people have heard this story. I go home. This is not cell phone time. I go home. I call my mother. I'm coming home. I don't want to be here. These are horrible people. They don't even know Frank Yerby, because, again, I'm in Augusta, Georgia. Frank Yerby, everybody knows Frank Yerby. And if you don't know, he was, the best-selling black author until he died. Now, of course, it's other writers. And he was in my hometown. We all knew him. I mean, he didn't live in Augusta, but we knew his work, and everybody had his signed copies of his books. And I said, Mom, he doesn't know anything. He's teaching me, but he doesn't know anything. And she said, well, I guess you found your job. If you want people to know what you think they should know, one, you got to be a teacher. Now, she's a second grade teacher, right? You got to be a teacher. And you got to write the books. But, of course, what I didn't know, I had to find the books. Because the books were not out there in great number. There were a few people we knew who had written. There were a few anthologies. Negro Caravan from the 1940s. We know from Slavery to Freedom. The Negro Caravan was the literary version of that. So there were some books out there, but they were just few and far between. So I guess with my mother's encouragement, first of all, she didn't let me come home. That would have been, one, embarrassing to go back home after you had gone to the white school. And she said, we don't do that. You were sent there to learn something. You don't like what you're learning. You think there's a problem. You got to fix it. And it didn't occur to me that I should question what my mother said. She's a second grade teacher. She knew everything. So I really, when Barbara and others ask me, where was this passion to do what I do and still do? It really was, if you see a problem, you got to fix it. Whatever skills you have, whatever abilities you can bring to the table, and you got to share that knowledge with other people because you can't do it by yourself. Communal experiences were my most significant. My father died when I was young, so I'm in a woman-centered household, godmothers, women in the church. I'm in a woman-centered household. So for me, if there's something to be done, you do it. Okay. You don't worry about the fact that you don't have enough people, because there's everybody that's willing to come to the table when you know something needs to be done. So I did finish Chapel Hill, so I have this HBCU PWI education. But as I like to tell people, I also looked up because the woman who had said to me to go to Chapel Hill had studied at Hampton Institute. So I go back to her to say, okay, I think I want to go to grad school. I wasn't 21, so once again, my mother told me I had to come back home. I couldn't go to grad school because I wasn't old enough, so I taught high school when I was 19 years old. Students were older than me. It was fascinating. I taught a class called Social Problems. I have no idea to today what that was supposed to mean. But anyway, it was filled with seniors in high school. I'm looking like a high school senior anyway. And I stayed home a year, and then Northwestern University had a scholarship that someone told me about. And so I asked my mother, Mom, I know I'm not 21 or whatever. If I get this scholarship, can I go? So I got the scholarship. I go to Northwestern University, and I met Margaret Walker. She was teaching, she taught at Jackson State University, but she was spending that one semester at Northwestern.
And that's what your latest book is on, right?
My biography is on Margaret Walker because I felt like that was fate. So I went to Northwestern. There was a lot of activity. The people that taught you were at Northwestern, and this was just a really, really big time. But my field was literature. I mean, I was a storyteller, a story listener. I wanted to write those stories. So that was my mother refusing to let me come back home, basically.
All right, now we got into mentors. All right, so that's where we're going now. Who were your mentors in the field, and how did their mentorship influence the way you teach and mentor students at the University of Kansas? And what is the importance of a mentorship? You're on.
I'm on. So I mentioned a couple of the mentors that I had, Fred Morton and James Giblin. Peter Nazareth was also at the University of Iowa. They were very influential on me. Particularly the diasporic aspect of what I did and still do. But then going to the University of Massachusetts, I knew who they were when I got there. And again, to describe the University of Massachusetts, the core group of people that were there when I got there were 7 faculty members. Most of them had been there, like I said, for 45 years. The department started out of a student protest. Michael Thelwell was a student at the time. Esther Terry was a student at the time. Eugene Terry was a student at the time. Bernard Bell was a student at the time. He was no longer there when I got there. And the protest took over a dormitory. And then out of that, they said they're going to create a Black Studies department. And then the comment to Sidney Kaplan, English department, a person who's Sterling Brown, a faculty member at Howard University. Sterling Brown was no longer taking graduate students, so he was sending all these people up to study with Sidney Kaplan. And they said, well, who's going to be the department? And Sydney's response, the way the story goes, is, well, you graduate, and you graduate all this year, so there's your faculty, right? And they created the faculty, without going into the full details, they create this unique group of people that come there. Most of them are civil rights activists, veterans, members of SNCC. Michael Thelwell was Stokely Carmichael's best friend. He ran the Washington, D.C. office of SNCC, wrote most of Stokely's actual written speeches, right? The ad-lib speeches Stokely would have done on his own. Then they hire a very important individual in my life who just passed away, John Bracey, who comes from Northwestern via Rochester. He comes to Northwestern, then Rochester, then to UMass. But Mike knew him through SNCC, CORE, and a group called the Revolutionary Action Movement. And then it's just a civil rights phone tree that they use, right? So Mike is just going down this list. So then they say, well, Ernest Allen is up in Detroit, teaching at Wayne State in Michigan. We know him from the Revolutionary Action Movement and the League of Black Revolutionary Workers. So let's see if Ernie wants to come, right? And they call Ernie, and he's like, oh yeah, we'll come, right? And they all think they're going to stay there for 5 years at the most, right? Mm-hmm. Get some covered in the 70s, and then all this money's coming, and then they'll leave and go back and do the activism that they do. But that core group stays there for a number of years. And then in the 90s, they create the second PhD program in African American Studies. And I went to study with particularly two individuals in that department, and that was John Bracey and Ernest Allen. And the way that they mentored me and taught me, I went to them because they do intellectual history, and they were stalwarts in Black studies. I knew both of their works. I probably knew more than anyone in the department at the time as students. I probably knew Ernest Allen's work the most because I researched the Nation of Islam, which he was a very early scholar on, and he particularly wrote these incredible essays on Black intellectual history that I really liked. John Bracey was a person who did anthologies and brought material, collected materials. Many things that we have in the archives today, microfilmed, was because of his work with his mentors. But I went to study with both of them. Ernie, as I explained before, I was in Japan. Ernie actually sent me a letter in Japanese telling me I was accepted, which frightened me. And I quickly explained, after many days with my wife, what do I do here? I had to write back to him and say that I can, this is wonderful, but I'm not your translator. That's a very interesting way to get involved with your mentor, right? This is nice, but I'm not doing that, right? He's like, no, I've been studying Japanese for 10 years and I've never been able to write anyone. So you could read that, right? I was like, yeah, but I'm not your translator. So going to them in the way that the care that they gave to me as their student, the knowledge that they pushed for me. I would go and be in a classroom talking to them, and then the next day, my mailbox may be filled with documents based on that conversation. They would never say anything. They would never say, you didn't understand what I was talking about. There would just be a stack of material that I was supposed to read, and it was the indication, like, you weren't quite there, right? We enjoyed this conversation, but you're not there. Right, and they always were pushing, always, it's for the field, right? It's not an individual process. That's the one thing I got from all of them. I mean, it's not about the individual. It's about the field. It's about the collective as a unit. I mean, to tell you a very quick story for them, when they got the PhD program, not a single one of them in the department was a full professor, right? And so when the PhD program got acknowledged by the Board of Regents, they said, but no one is a full professor in your department. They said, oh, we can correct that, right? And they all turned in their material. And when I asked them about that years later, they explained to me that they were never going to allow the university to judge them. They all had tenure, right? They were associate professors. They had a union, so they got a 2% raise every year. But they were never going to put in the position where the college or the university could dictate whether or not they were enough scholar or not, right? And so that taught me that collective nature. And what I try to bring I think, back to my students, whether that's in the classroom, in mentoring as graduate students, understanding the collective nature, the field itself, the importance of the field, and the lack of, it's not the lack, the desire, it's not about me. It's not about me as an individual standing up and saying, look at my books, right? It's, if you find my books, that's great. I mean, Allison's in the audience. I mean, we had a mutual grad student who went to the University of Massachusetts, and they have this what they call the major works, which is in the field is a terror. Everyone knows it. You read 57 books in your first semester, right? It's a 2-semester course. It's an introduction to the field. What they basically describe it as, John Bracey used to always say, it was an attempt to get everyone to what you would have gotten if you had done an undergraduate degree with them in 1 year. So everyone is on the same level and the same knowledge base as you go into those other classes. But it is intense. And as you know, I had a graduate student here who studied the turn of the century Black intellectual thought with me. I never told him to read my book. He should read it if he's doing the work, right? But he calls me the first day at Massachusetts and says, do you know that we read your book as one of the 57 books, right? It's selected as one of the 57 books. I said, yes. I hope you enjoy it, right? That's the point, because I'm not the one that should tell it, but I'm glad it's been selected there. But it's not about me. It's not about that, what I'm doing and trying to put a shiny star on it. It's about the field, the work, let the work do itself, speak for myself. That's one thing I've learned as being a white scholar in the field. I'm not going to get out there and tell you. I let the work speak for itself and do that from that perspective. And my mentors taught me that and always humbled me, always humbled me. The last story I'll tell you is John Bracey. Again, he's in my mind a lot because he just passed away. But John Bracey and I were going back and forth in a class about St. Clair Drake, one of his professors at Roosevelt University, before he goes to Northwestern, stalwart in the field, and we're going back on his famous book, Black Metropolis. And we're arguing, and John, I always used to joke that John would intellectually throw you against the wall and make you fight your way out, right? And do it in a loving way, but he would, and he's telling me I didn't understand, back and forth. And I'm like, no. And the next day I went to my mailbox and there was an article, printed out speech in there. In the corner it says, please read from JB. I peel it back, and in the corner of that, the copy says, to JB from St. Clair, keep for your records. It was an essay by St. Clair Drake thinking about that book that had never been published. And that's what John was using for his debate with me, which I'm like, well, that's unfair. He's like, well, you should know it. It's in the archives. Go find it.
Go find it.
Right? And so that type of work and love and care.
All right.
I mean, I still talk to Ernest Allen almost every single week. There's an email correspondence or a phone call. And that's unique. I mean, I've been away from the University of Massachusetts for almost 20 years.
All right. Now, you've listened to both of them now. You know where they're coming from. You know their background. So now we're going to get to, why is it that so many people are uncomfortable when we start talking about race?
You get that one first, Maryam.
This is an interesting question because when I was in graduate school, we were always inserting into every conversation questions having to do with race. So every class I took, Cornell was where I ended up going, I would turn the class into an opportunity to learn as much as I could. And I had no trouble with my professors agreeing, one, because they were learning too, which I later realized. So, and this was true for white and black professors, that this notion of, I have figured out that I'm going to be taking classes, whether it was at Carolina, that experience got repeated to some extent at Cornell, but they had a big controversy,
Right.
so they were more aware of the need to do something different, that I was having to find stuff for that class that was relevant for me to study in conjunction with the content of that class. That was for me the entire part of my graduate education. No matter what class it was, I was going to find the missing pieces that made that class significant for me. So I was constantly in the library, which is why I probably should have been a librarian, because I was always in the library looking for stuff and talking to librarians about people that they knew who could give me answers to questions that nobody else could. So I kept that thread from HBCUs because a lot of the schools really had amazing libraries, Atlanta University, Howard University, Dorothy Corder Wesley, people like that who were still dedicated to those institutions. So I was creating, Shawn talks about a network. I was creating a network all the time. So we were talking about race in those very concrete ways. Did you know that this is who did that or who did something else? So, but I think the fear that this truth emerges, documented, publishing industry was making a lot of money reprinting books that people found. It literally brought them back. Motion picture industry was making money, giving us stories like Roots. Industries were making money on race-based material. So when that began to happen, the discomfort of talking about race, because it was turning into money, didn't seem quite so problematic. But then when people start turning that knowledge into power, whether you want to call it black power or whatever, when you start moving in other echelons where power is available to you, I think the fear becomes heightened. So there was a moment when, again, it seemed to be very relevant to have race front and center. It was profitable. It did give us new opportunities that we didn't have before. Students were flocking to schools. Black studies was cropping up everywhere in institutions. This is the Black Studies era. Books are being written. Public intellectuals, that term, become popular. And so that moment, I think, gave an opening for people in positions of power who could help move things along. So what makes people uncomfortable, I think, is that the truth goes deeper and deeper because we've been doing it now for a really long time. If John Hope Franklin could write, what, 47 from slavery to freedom, and you read that book and you realize how deep this goes, or the Tulsa riots we're just learning about now, more than 100, I mean, this is just incredible.
Which is interesting because the Tulsa thing was 1921.
That's right, that's right.
And the book didn't come out until when?
2021?
2021.
Yes. So when you start digging and you see how deep this stuff goes, it frightens people, and then the shift in power is a potential threat. So race no longer becomes a profitable enterprise. It brings more students to school. Foundations are giving scholarships to get people through grad school. I mean, I am the original scholarship kid, all the way through, scholarship kid. I'm probably one of the few people who didn't come out of college.
But you earned it. You went to college at 15.
I did. But I mean, I didn't come away with a lot of debt. That's what I mean. I got scholarships to help me through. But when you start turning that knowledge into power, and you see that possibilities of a different world, then people really fear this loss of control. And race becomes associated with replacement. The word we hear a lot now. Replacement. We are the ones that gave you this opportunity to do this, and now you are taking over. And then you unite with other people of color and make this world welcoming, these United States welcoming to the world's people.
All right, pick up on there.
So, I mean, I agree. I think it's fear. I would say that we have, using the U.S. as our context, we have a lot invested in the myth of America. And then the myth of America is I will say raceless, but it's really white.
Yeah.
White history, the white race. And we've created that myth. And if you don't understand and realize that when our Constitution is written, Europeans are a minority in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Right? There's more indigenous and African individuals living in the United States than that. So your Constitution is a minority document of minority rule. And that Constitution itself is a pro-slavery document. There are 3 elements of that Constitution that uphold slavery. So that you've got the Constitution which talks about the 3/5 clause, 3/5 of the black population can be counted for representation. You've got the Atlantic slave trade, that we're going to allow the slavery to be continued for 20 years to recoup the property of individuals, right? Those elements, and then we have the property clause, right, that says you have to return property that is stolen, right? Mm-hmm. And we don't have to think very hard that they're not asking for someone to return a wagon, right, that goes between Massachusetts, right, and Virginia. It's because the northern states are getting emancipation at that moment, right, whatever that is, gradual or not, and they're saying that it doesn't match up with the southern property laws, and we must do that. So if we look at that document itself, using that document as our foundation and understanding of our country, and we always talk about the founding fathers and original intent and everything like that, we have a myth of what that document is. And that document, the myth of that document, is it has nothing to do with race, but it has everything to do with race, right? And right after that, we passed the naturalization law that says blacks can never be citizens of the United States, right? And we have to overturn that. So the Constitution itself and the rewriting of that Constitution in the post-Civil War era, getting rid of that naturalization law, those type of things are all there. And that myth gets to the core of what our nation's about. Right? And what people don't want to know and are afraid to understand is the true history. Right? Because it will change the way that they perceive themselves. It will change the privileges that they've had, right? And they don't want they can't reconcile that in their mind. So every time that you push against that history, John Hope Franklin and other individuals who are pushing that history, they begin to be challenged. And the moment that we're sitting in right now is not a surprise to people who study history, because we've come once. It's cyclical, right? It goes over and over again. And what I always tell people to do is go read a wonderful essay. It was a speech originally and then published by Derek Bell in 1995, 96, called Who's Afraid of Critical Race Theory? Right? Should put light bulbs off in your head, right? But of course, what he's telling you, what he actually says in that is, I'm not afraid of the criticism. We're having the criticism because we're being successful, right? The moment right now we're being successful, we're challenging this myth. We're challenging the understanding, and that has brought people out of the woodwork to tell us we're wrong and try to stop us from doing what we're doing. It's the same thing. You can track the most recent events, right? And words like replacement and other things like that popping up which is not new. It was there before. Right? So words are popping up in this moment because of the reaction that people are having. And you can track it to the election of Barack Obama, the belief that we were, in the statement that we were in a post-racial society, which no one truly believed, right? The death of Trayvon Martin. Most of our kids that are in our classrooms today, we need to understand that they're graduating right now. Their public consciousness is from Trayvon Martin to today. That's a decade, right? They're coming to life in their political consciousness usually in middle school. That is their understanding. So think of what's happened from Trayvon Martin to the moment of today, to George Floyd, or to January or February 27th, 2023. That has always been there. And so we have this challenge coming in. On top of that, then, the biggest push comes because of the project, the 1619 Project in the New York Times. The fact that that's published in the New York Times. It's not, anyone in the field does not think that that work is groundbreaking. I was one of the individuals who proofread it for the New York Times. I was like, oh, this is good, great, right? The controversy that comes up in the wake of that has everything to do with the fact that it's challenging their political narrative. And if you pay attention, they're only challenging the introduction, right?
Oh, that's true.
They're not talking about the individual essays that are there about gentrification and other things, right? They're only talking about the introduction, right? And we need to understand then why are they doing that? Because that challenges their narrative. It makes them pivot, right? And we can track all of those things all the way to the creation of the AP African American Studies course, which again I was involved with. And I asked the AP, like, one, why do you want to do this? I don't know who you're going to get to teach these classes.
So
First
what
of all,
do you see as the response? The response you're seeing is let's stop this march toward
Exactly.
knowledge.
As they
Let's
do all the
stop
time.
it.
Exactly.
Let's get rid of the
Yep.
AP, let's get rid of Black history, because this march toward knowing and knowledge for this generation that you
Absolutely.
just described is going to mean everybody's going to know the truth.
Exactly.
They're going to turn on us
Exactly.
because they will know the truth. This march toward history, march toward opening up knowledge and digging up the truth is frightening because it will mean a transfer of power.
No question.
And white authority will potentially be forever changed. Who wants to share power? So that is why the attack on things that are very specific. Don't let the kids coming through school now get all this knowledge that the ones 10 years ago, or we, were responsible for helping
Absolutely.
to create.
Right.
Stop it right now.
Even though that's a myth as well.
Yeah,
right?
right,
Because
yeah.
the AP history class, or the African American Studies class, few people are going to take that.
That's right, exactly.
It's a small group of people. It's a
But
billion-dollar corporation.
It's that
It's the idea,
population,
yeah.
it's that
gonna
population
do-
who rises
Exactly.
to the top.
I mean, as
They become the leaders,
Exactly.
and so you want to take the elite class and make
This
sure.
is the beauty of a moderator. Just watch it. Just watch it right over here. Let them go at it, you know.
But
And
it's-
see, I just stayed out of it. I mean, that's what I knew they would do. All you had to do was just kind of push it in there just a little bit so that we get it. But I don't want you to be left out. I want you to get in this conversation now, because, you know, a conversation cannot just be one way. It's been three-way right here, but now I'm going to pull you in on this one way. For those who may be listening on streaming, if you have a question, you can send it in to dolequestions@ku.edu. But then I also will ask the people with the microphones, I have two here, that you will come, raise your hand if you have a question, and you can join in on this conversation now. They've already told you about where it is, the balance of power and what's going on, and I've been seeing people nodding, I've been seeing smiling, I've seen people take the pen out and they're writing on the paper. I mean, I don't want you to miss a thing. So I'll start with you first. Would you get to him, please?
For the stream.
I got it, thank you.
Introduce
Hi,
yourselves.
I'm Adrian Lewis. I'm a professor here also. So, good seeing you both. I thought you might add to that discussion you just had, the accounts of the Civil War, the lost cause, the myths that surround that. Recently we're going through this changing the names of all these military forts, taking down some of these statues. Can you sort of add that, integrate that into your discussion, the one that you were just having?
All right.
Well, again, you're revealing the truth, and it becomes a public truth. When you talk about statues and monuments, you're talking about that's publicly available. You can't stop that tide of knowledge from being created. Books are going to be written that tell a different story, because students are going to recognize that Somehow, what we thought was the case is not the case. And so it's going too far. I'm speaking as on the other side here. It's just going too far. Come on. We gave y'all this. And now you want to take everything away, our monuments. And so when that history becomes living history, I mean, that's the difference, I think. Well, Shawn said he doesn't call himself a historian. I like the idea of living history. That is, people are living these experiences all the time, and that is what transforms people, living a particular history, understanding knowledge, seeing themselves in that history. So you're right. If you do all of these things, it frightens people to death.
Yeah, I would add to that. I mean, I think the important thing to remember about the monuments and many of the naming of bases and things is when they were done, right? It's not done in 1865, right? It's done in the late 19th century, really the 20th century.
Lost
right?
cause.
It becomes the lost cause. And so most of these things are being erected to create a certain history and historical myth. So, you know, we're putting up, I mean, Professor Lewis here does military history, so I'll be very direct, right? We're putting up monuments to traitors, to individuals who actually, you know, committed treason and responded and broke up our country. We're putting up monuments to countries that, a foreign country. The Confederacy of the United States was a separate country, that there's separate government, separate money, on down the line. So we're asking our nation, the United States, to recognize a foreign nation in our midst. And it's done to create that certain narrative and done that. When they put up the Lee statue in Richmond in 1890, 91, 92, T. Thomas Fortune, one of the main people I write about, is there covering it. He is horrified by what he's saying, right? And he says at the time he's never seen such a moment where you have a stark contrast of a white and black crowd. The white crowd is yelling and cheering, and the black crowd is sitting there silent and heads down. And he also says we have the traitor's flag waving in the audience. That's one of the last times you actually will see the Confederate battle flag, the Virginia battle flag, being waved in the South until the 1920s, really the 1940s, and that comes back. So that myth story that it does, and all those statues being raised, is going to create a narrative that challenges the American myth, right? And that's why, again, we also need to understand that all the way up to John Hope Franklin in the 1940s, most of the textbooks and taught in the U.S. actually ended with Reconstruction into the 20th century. And that story of Reconstruction and how that was told becomes a story of black incompetence, right? Why did we do this black Reconstruction? We should have never done it. It was a failure. The tragic era, all of that carries forward. And those are the people who are teaching my parents, right, that are taught by that. So then when I come and say I'm doing this Black Studies thing, my parents are like, well, that's not what I was taught, right? And they're challenging it, but I'm like, but it's in the books. Like, go read them, right? Because of that, and that's what's challenging these people today. We don't want that myth. We don't want that challenge from our students or the new generation to question what is in the books and who gets to write those books. Yeah. Pay attention to what's going on in Florida. Yeah. Right? It's not just what's going on. It's how they're going to then craft. The next step for DeSantis is going to be craft who gets to write those textbooks. Yeah. And what story is going to be in that textbook, right? That's a scary, scary move, right?
All right. I think I want to call on Catherine. I think she has something from online. Would you read it, please?
Yes, I have an online question from Taylor, and her question is for Maryemma Graham, and it is, do you think that hardship and sacrificial experiences are mostly individual or instead a shared experience in the Black community?
Hardship and what was the other?
Sacrifice.
And sacrifice.
Yeah.
There are collective experiences, a collective memory of people who have suffered.
Are they a collective experience for the Black community, or are they individualized?
Yeah, all people have those kinds of experiences. Now, if what might be underneath that question, and I don't know who the questioner was, is that somehow that is unique to Black people. That, in my mind, somehow might put us in this counter-argument stage of thinking, that somehow that is a unique experience for Black people. All communities have some aspect of that. But the question is impact. The issue is, what is the impact of the collective suffering? The laws that dictate and cause it. And so I think that is where, and that's why I said to Barbara, sometimes I don't need to talk about race. I need to talk about impact. What is the impact of something that's collectively experienced, that's part of our collective memory? And when that impact begins to be so visible and so heinous, then you can begin to see why you don't want to use that to sort of counter as if everybody suffers, everybody has this experience. Yes, they do. But what is the impact of that ultimately? And where is the shift of power going? So I don't know if that answers the question, but I'm trying to interpret how that might be misunderstood as a peculiar experience that Black people have, but you got to take the next step. What's the impact of that kind of suffering?
I mean,
What's the ultimate impact of it?
I think to add to that, I think you're exactly right. I think the other piece of it is, again, using the historical narrative that we do too often in the country, is that the Black experience is only resistance and pain.
Yeah.
And so, but we have to pay attention to love, art, culture, everything that's being existed in a community no different than any other community.
Yeah.
But we as a world, as a nation, only talk about slavery, possibly, right? I'm not saying we do these things in depth, but we talk about slavery, we talk about, death, we may talk about lynching, etc., right? That's the historical narrative, the creation of Jim Crow. That is the pain, that is the suffering that exists, and we never get out of that story. But what exists within that story is a community like Maryemma's telling you about in Augusta, Georgia, that is filled with love and history and culture that's bringing that to the community. And we need stories to complement that. Georgia is also a place of resistance. It's also a place of pain. But the story that you heard from her was a story of love and caring. And we need to focus on that as much, but we don't do that in the historical narrative.
Of course, John Lewis is, of course, our man.
Yeah.
All right, other questions? Did we have enough right here?
I'm trying to figure out how to word this. This is looking into the future, and it's something I think about. You're absolutely right that fear of replacement is huge. My question is power really a zero-sum proposition? If one group gains power, does that necessarily mean another group loses power?
Definitions of power. I think you would have to get into some of the theory of different kinds of systems of power. There are systems of power that make space for everybody, that are based on equity. That would be a system of power. Other systems of power are intended to destroy and bring other people to the leadership. So I think systems of power are at the heart of some of this discussion. And so we are seeing now systems of power emerge before our very eyes. And people are naming it. I mean, woke theory, all kinds of stuff that is being, characterized as, what people should not be doing, what should not be learning. But I think the systems of power is what we don't fundamentally grasp a full understanding of. All systems were not the same. The American system flipped. We started out as a place of freedom to worship, leaving a place where you didn't have that, come into a place of freedom. And then that system flips, enslaves people, and refuses the rights that you came and enjoyed, others refuse. So power is a very strange thing. You know, I'm not a political theorist, I'm not a political scientist, but we do see these flip-flops. We got a flip-flop right now, thinking we were headed in one direction, only to discover we're heading in another direction.
Yeah. I mean, I would agree, and I think what I'd add is a colleague of ours, Jari Peters, has been running a piece on misinformation and disinformation. So you should go watch that. It's been a series that's been going on all year. But we also live in that, and discussion of power is actually part of that misinformation and disinformation. One example I will give you, theoretically, no, one person getting power, one group getting power should not change anything.
Right.
But the myth and the disinformation around that makes people believe it. So to give you the quick example that I will give you, I'll do this in the Dole Institute, but when Barack Obama was pushing for the Affordable Health Care Act, it became a discussion by a person named Lindsey Graham and Rush Limbaugh and others that this was nothing but reparations for black people, right? This was a way he was figuring out to get black people money. And they ran that and kept telling people that this is reparations, it means nothing. It is health care, right? It is health care. It's a system that is there to help anyone. As the joke, my students will know I've used this joke before. So what happens is, theoretically or in hypothetically here, Barack Obama has the black cabal underneath the White House running the government, right, is really what's going through these people's mind, right? And Obama comes in one day and says, I finally figured it out. I know how to get reparations, right? And we'll be very direct here, understanding that this can be painful for some people. But he finally looks at everyone and says, cancer, right? Because the only way you get money from the healthcare system is you get sick, right? So understand the logic and misinformation that is being pushed on the individuals to be told that this is going to become reparations. So that disinformation, misinformation being fed to people makes them think, right, that one group of people has gained power and is going to rule over you. The other instance was Rush Limbaugh talked about a white student being beat up on a school bus in Illinois, right, shortly after Barack Obama became president. And his response to his millions of followers was, this is Barack Obama's America. Mm-hmm. White kids are going to be beat up every day, right? That's the type of information that's being fed. And we can trace that way back, right, to the early periods of Rush Limbaugh gaining his power and the amount of misinformation, right? He's no Buckley, right? He was no Buckley. He's passed away, right? But he's no Buckley. And a person who actually could debate people, read things, and had a serious debate on the conservative side, right? Mm-hmm. So that type of thing makes people believe that one side will gain that power. So I think that's... Yeah.
All right. We had a conversation on race. We have another question? Yes, right in front. Was there someone over here with a question? Yes. Okay, that one right here, please. I'm sorry, not pointing.
I'm glad you brought up conservatives.
Mm-hmm. Maybe.
Yeah, I am. I'm fortunate enough to meet with, on a fairly regular basis, a bunch of Republicans for a neighboring county. And I hear a lot of criticism of CRT, so on and so forth. And we're going to see some conservative black Republicans, Tim Scott, I think, from South Carolina. Mm-hmm. Is there any validity to some of these arguments in terms of they don't want handouts, Democrats are taking advantage of them, they're tired of being victimized, or is this just posturing, or a little of both?
By Scott?
Well, no. Just conservative Republicans in general. Those seem to be the big criticism.
Yeah, my quick response, and then Maryemma could speak on it more, I think. But I think my quick response, of course, is posturing. It's politics. And you're going to use whatever you're doing. So the second that we have a group of white, now conservative, because we talk in 1970s, it would have been conservatives pushing this issue. But the second that we have white conservatives in Missouri, Kansas, the Farm Belt, tell you that they don't want the farm bill, then I understand that they don't want a handout, right? Because the farm bill is passed every year, and millions of dollars are given to white farmers to not plant in a farm. I mean, that is Marxism on a large scale, right? So understand what that is, and stop picking and choosing on what we're doing. No different than the healthcare system, right? Hands off my Medicare was the signs numerous times in the audiences when people are talking about the healthcare system. This is just a handout. Hands off my Medicare. What is Medicare? Right? So the misinformation and disinformation that is there. So yeah, I think but that's politics. It's a lot of posturing. Unfortunately, we don't have journalists that push them anymore to challenge that posturing, right? And if they do, they won't get asked a question or the ability to ask them a question again. So again, we're away from that era of people who will point at those, right? I mean, I grew to get frustrated with them. Well, we don't have even today's talk. This week on ABC is not This Week with David Brinkley. It's not the same, and I don't think that David Brinkley was the best, but it's not the same probing type of questions, right? Because we've changed that.
So let's look at flip the switch here. There's a reason why everybody is concerned about the next generation, the coming generation, why the attack is on education, the attack is on Black studies, why the attack. Because every time we've had a radical shift, we see young people. So part of the benefit that I had was coming after the Black Arts Movement. That movement which brought greater inclusion, where art was seen differently, where the production, tremendous production in all cultural forms came out of the richness of a youth culture. It was a youth culture. Whether it's the French Revolution, think of all the revolutions that we've had. We talk about young people going off to war, going to fight, wanting to protect. So I think when I am at my most positive moment, I'm thinking and hoping and praying that we do have an underground, a swelling of young people who are defying and refusing what's being taken away from them, which is why education is so important, and the reason why I hesitate to retire, but I must. Because I realize that this is so essential to give people the truth, to give them the tools, to give them the sense of working together so that we don't turn back the clock. So I want to put that hopeful idea out there, is that revolutions begin, they are pushed, they're advanced by generations of young people. And so we have to figure out how to try to rally and push as hard as we can. And in this population, the Dole Institute, this politics can do it, education can do it. Giving that opportunity, I mean, I watch Joy, for lots of reasons on MSNBC, and I know she gives a platform to a lot of young people. That's getting harder and harder. So I think that my appeal always is to really give more cushion to that rising tide that can push against this. There's some powerful voices, young voices out there. And it has to be a collaboration. It has to be, it cannot be only male, only female. It's got to be transgender. It's got to be all the community people who believe in the truth. And can't just be academic and non-academic. It's got to really be a larger groundswell. Because I still have the hope that this is not going to be a complete flop into a graveyard. I mean, I shouldn't say this because I know we're on the air, but when I think about the voices I hear, Marjorie Taylor Greene, for God's sake, I just have great difficulty understanding how leadership could become, I don't want to get to the end of that sentence. I have great difficulty. Let me just put it there.
She's from your state.
So I'm just saying that young people are fighting hard, and I think our job is to help them fight and support that fight, to give those voices much more airtime. I don't think that we are headed into oblivion.
Yeah, I mean,
I have to put that in there because, I have to be hopeful.
yeah, you're an educator, right? So
I'm an educator, I gotta be helpful, and I cannot see that everybody is so blindsided, they can't wake up someday and say, oh my God, what was I thinking? I mean, really?
Yeah. I think just real quick, and then there's another question, but I will go back to...
We will have you, and then I'm going to have to close. We're getting there. Go ahead.
So just back to I think the difference here as well is, putting it back and bringing it back to the center of the Dole Institute and Bob Dole and the politics and how politics have changed. Bob Dole would have never been running to a camera in the halls of Congress to get his voice on the radio, on the television, without talking to the minority or majority leader. And more than likely, the majority of the minority leader would not have allowed it because they would have kept everyone together, right? We have changed in the last 20 years of politics to, again, the politics of the individual and the individual spotlight on television every single night to voice your opinions and be there. You may show up on a weekly talk show. 24 News Hour shows have transformed the way that we've done it, right? And that gives a person like Green and others a space that didn't exist and actually had a different rapport with politics. And it wasn't the politics of individualism. It wasn't the politics of gotcha. It wasn't the politics of, can I say the most outlandish thing that will get me money and press attention, right? Because a person like Green and others, we can choose people on the left or the right, will say different things because it raises them money today. And they're running to that news camera to say it, and then they will issue a fundraising campaign email saying, did you see me on Fox News? Did you see me on MSNBC? That didn't exist in Bob Dole's day. Would he have talked to the newspapers? Absolutely, but not in the same way, and certainly not without talking about whatever power he's in, the minority and majority leaders. I use the Democratic example. Tip O'Neill would have never allowed this to happen, right? He would have kept the control of that. And what we've changed then, again, with the society is we've become a society of individuals. Individuals who rise to raise money and I hope a lot of posturing, because if it's not, there's a lot more ignorance in this country than I believe as an educator, right? So because of what people say, our school systems are failing us in many, many more ways, if it's truth, right? But it's all to get it's the way the system has changed, and I think we'll never get it back. We'll never get it back because it's run, and the amount of social media and everything like that has transformed this. When I said I lived in Japan, this is the last thing I'll say. I lived in Japan. I left Japan with OJ's Bronco. CNN was the only channel we had. And it wasn't 24 hours of popular, opinion shows. But that Bronco and the discussion, the trial after that, made a moment where the United States talked about race. And it was made a moment where the United States figured out people will tune into this and watch the same people say the same things over and over and over again. And then when I returned from Japan, when we came back, there's Fox News. I remember going into a house, my wife and I looked at it and said, what is this? Not in a bad way, just like, what? I don't understand this. What is this thing in the background? That has changed us in that time period, and we have to see that from 1995 to the present, and how drastically our politics, our educational system, And the way we talk about race, economic issues, et cetera, has changed. It's a bizarre world.
Let me jump in. When the students asked us to do something on the cutting edge and talk about race, that was risky. But we did not shy away from it. And I'm sure when people listen, it's a little awkward for some people, a little intimidating, as I said earlier, but it is a necessary conversation that has to take place. I listened to both of our guests this evening, and especially to the people who are listening online. Sometimes the truth will liberate you, yes, but the truth will also hurt. And I think that's something we have to come to terms with. As you know, we are bipartisan here. We get to voice our opinions, respect the opinions of others. And race is one of those lines that people feel you're not too sure you can cross. But if we're going to bring about change, we're going to have to be honest about what really happens and give people their own space. But you cannot deny history that happened in the past. We still honor George Washington. We still talk about Abraham Lincoln. We still have all of that part of the history that's important. It's only some parts of history that we don't remember or we don't want to remember. But because we don't want to remember does not mean that the history did not happen. That's all I think most people are saying. And I notice we have some young people here this evening, and part of that was you're entitled to know the history and decide for yourself what you think and what you believe. It is our mission to just present it, let you learn from it, experience it on your own, and make that decision for yourself. We thank you very much for being with us this evening. And I think our two guests honestly told you what they feel, what their life was like, and why. And maybe the fact that the University of Kansas has the only Black Studies department in all of Kansas. There is a reason. The University of Kansas is not the perfect university. But we do have a history department. So keep that in mind, that our job on a university campus is to present the history, the coursework, a learning opportunity. And the Dole Institute tries to do that. So I thank you very much for being with us this evening, and please show your appreciation for our two guests. Good night, and thank you very much.